apologise for not doing slides, but I took a pledge a few years ago that unless I had pictures or graphs or visual things, I wasn't going to give talks with slides. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to start by acknowledging the great contribution that each and every one of you do make in radiological protection. It struck me last night seeing a room full of people that have come all around the world who are dedicated to one cause, the protection of our fellow citizens. In an area where there's a huge amount of emotion and misinformation, you provide wonderfully grounded science that underpins good, safe policy and good, safe regulation. And I'm in awe of the work you do and congratulate you for your great contributions around the world. I would say, though, that I am not a great expert in this area. As Chief Medical Officer for the Australian Government, I am the Principal Advisor, as you heard, and I do have responsibility for our Health Protection Office, which has a role in providing public health protection from a national coordination level. And we have a role in that function in providing overseeing the development of radiation and nuclear safety policy on a national level. We do this in partnership with our regulator counterparts in the states and territories and with the national leadership of our colleagues at ARPANSA, the Australian Radiation and Nuclear Safety Agency, a statutory authority I'm sure you know well. As a nephrologist, as you've heard by training, I'm not an expert in radiological protection, not like my colleague Carl Magnus and all of you in the room today. Indeed, I must confess at the outset to have been not all that safe in radiation in my distant past. In my previous research career, I used to have a big research lab. We did a lot of work in complement biology. I can recall a very serious encounter with a laboratory safety officer. This is a long time ago, I have to say, after a weekend in which I tried to do what my research group had consistently failed to do, is to get in situ hybridisation to work. After about 40 hours of frustrating work, I did get it functioning. I got some wonderful images, but it came in the next Monday to find a very serious radiation safety officer, complete with a counter showing just how much I had contaminated the entire laboratory with P32. At that time, I was told that I was best off supervising the work of my research group and that I would no longer be allowed to do wet work or have access to isotopes. So that was quite salutary. Another example from my distant past, which is probably not my fault, but just shows how far we've come in radiation protection. Way back when I was doing my PhD, I had a holiday job as the ski doctor at a ski resort. Part of the role of that doctor was to take limb radiographs of people who'd fallen over on the ski slopes. There was no training. There was a machine that looked like it was about 100 years old, a dark room with some tanks, and this scrappy notebook with some handwritten instructions on how to point and fire this machine, nothing more, no protective equipment at all, and God knows what was sprayed around that room. The quality of the radiographs were, as you can imagine, not very good. So I'm sure those sort of situations would never happen anywhere in Australia, although I suspect those of you who are involved in regulating the research community might have come across people like me whose research enthusiasm sometimes get away from them and their sense of safety. Researchers are very tricky people to regulate. In a much later role, as CEO of Austin Health in Melbourne, a large university teaching health service, I became much more sensible. You have to sort of be responsible as a CEO. And I had in that role not only many research laboratories, a very substantial diagnostic imaging service complete with PET scanning and a cyclotron, but also a very large radiation oncology service both at our main campus and in satellites. we relocated our main radiation oncology service to our very new Olivia Newton-John Cancer Centre with state-of-the-art new linear accelerators. And I can recall vividly in that redevelopment phase the heated debates between experts about the radiation safety aspects of building design, some of the demarcation disputes that probably still go on about what jobs actually needed a medical physicist to do, and the extraordinary knowledge that it took nearly 6 months to commission a new linear accelerator, the complexity of the safety provisions in that was quite extraordinary. As I said, we had a cyclotron, and we even installed a new cyclotron, tried to work out what to do with the old cyclotron, realised it was too hard and mothballed it. And we're at the cutting edge, really, of PET scanning with a lot of PET research. I mention these experiences at Austin Health because in all of them, even when there was robust debate about points of difference, everyone involved in radiological protection, radiation safety, was coming from a position that radiation safety could not be compromised, and that at all times a high margin for error must be maintained. It gave me great confidence that we have great standards and systems for radiological protection in Australia, and those working in this area in this country and all around the world should be very proud of that. But as we know, all systems and processes need to evolve, taking into account new developments and new information. Regulatory systems must be proportionate and not unnecessarily burdensome, and must move with the times with technology. Radiation safety does feature highly in the minds of the general public. In many cases, there is an unjustified fear, a fear of radiation that is disproportionately greater than the real risk. Many have postulated that this is due to the fact that radiation is not detectable by any of our senses. It cannot be objectively observed. Another factor is postulated to be the link between ionising radiation and nuclear weapons. This fear sometimes leads to a lack of trust in the experts. Take, for example, the current debate about a proposed radioactive waste facility which is likely to be developed in the state of South Australia. I would be supremely confident, from what I know about the standards that we have in this nation, that living right next door to such a facility would be one of the safest places to be. But try telling that to some of the opponents whose fear is, as I said, ungrounded and often based in myth rather than the science that you people are so good at promulgating. In my current role as the Commonwealth Chief Medical Officer, the largest representations of community concern that I get about radiation is actually in relation to non-ionising radiation, again probably based on the irrational fear of what can't be sensed. The irrational fear of telecommunications equipment, recently exacerbated by the rollout of 5G, consumes a lot of my time in reassuring politicians and the community about the science. I know that you're not talking about non-ionising radiation, but I must acknowledge that the patience and contribution of the team at Arpanza in EME, who deal with this very complex and emotionally charged issue, reassuring the public, providing the measurement data, and dealing with a range of people for whom rational debate is not sometimes possible. Even though it's day 3 of your meeting, it might be helpful for me to briefly describe the role of the Australian government in radiation protection, expanding on what I said at the outset. As you know, Arpanza is the government's primary authority on radiation protection and nuclear safety. It maintains the primary standards, auditing, diagnostic reference levels and education. Arpanza also plays a very important role in the international scene, representing the Australian government in many fora to promote international best practice. My Health Protection Division in the department focuses on policy development and regulatory reform of radiation protection by working with the states and territory governments, who are the primary regulators of radiation safety. One of the challenges in Australia, in many of our regulatory systems, is that we do work in a federation. In Australia, the states and territories have direct responsibility for managing radioactive materials and the associated risks. Standards are consistently high across each of these jurisdictions, but a recent international peer review mission facilitated by the International Atomic Energy Agency highlighted some inconsistencies in our regulatory framework. Whilst all our systems were seen to be strong and safe, variation across the country can cause confusion and a burden for industry. It's very pleasing, therefore, that we now have a commitment from all jurisdictions to harmonise our regulatory framework, and the Commonwealth Department is pleased to play a facilitative role in that process. There were some other recommendations coming out of that international mission, such as ensuring that all regulators have the right resources to do their job, and that the Commonwealth must progress the development of radioactive and decommissioning strategies, again, which are being developed in a collaborative model. We're hopeful that a repeat mission in a few years may say that we are even stronger than we are now. Today's topic is on medical radiation. In this specific area, there is constant change and development and many emerging challenges. I might talk about the CT scan because it's an interesting example where we have seen so much change over a long time. It's been one of the most important inventions in diagnostic imaging, and the evolution of the technology has been truly amazing. It spanned my whole medical career. I was a young doctor at the Royal Melbourne Hospital in Melbourne when the very first head-only CT scanner was delivered, and we saw those with great awe, those incredible grainy, poor quality pictures that came out of that scanner. Compare that to the now over 700,000 CT head scans that are done in Australia each year on machines the likes of which we could never have dreamt of in the 1970s when we first saw that head scanner. The capacity and complexity of CT scanners has increased hugely with the advent of 3D reconstructions, converting what were previously invasive investigations into non-invasive ones, but with attendant significant increases in radiation exposure. But at the same time, the industry have made significant advances in technology which have been able to also substantially reduce the unit exposure, even with some of these complex studies. The quality and versatility of CT scanning is now so good that some clinicians are tempted to use it to replace good quality clinical assessments. As a hospital CEO in my last job, I got very angry hearing about a certain surgical registrar who had said to the emergency department that he would not come and see anyone with abdominal pain unless the CT scan had been done and the pictures were there for him to have a look at. That's not good medicine. The over-reliance on medical imaging, particularly by less confident doctors, and we do see that in all areas of medicine, combined with the public's desire to have a test to investigate a symptom, means that there is emerging evidence of overuse of CT scanning in some circumstances. For example, repeated abdominal CT scans in patients with chronic symptoms when the previous 5 or 6 scans can't be found, and CTs of the lumbosacral spine in patients with simple lower back pain, an investigation which is rarely beneficial. There is now a whole field and study of medicine examining medical waste and overdiagnosis. But in the field of CT scanning, particularly repeated CT scanning, the issue of potential long-term effects from radiation are a relevant consideration. In the Department of Health, we frequently get correspondence from concerned citizens and concerned clinicians and researchers. I know John Matthews is in the audience and would like to talk to me about this issue later. There is ongoing research in this area which is very difficult to study because of the extremely long time needed for follow-up. I'm sure that there will be abstracts that have or will be presented at this meeting on this topic, including studies in the high-risk environment of pregnancy and in younger people generally. There's also been very substantial growth in PET scanning, which has been great in the diagnosis and management of cancers, but it's also now routinely combined with CT scanning, and with a relatively high combined radiation dose, albeit in a largely older population for whom long-term radiation risks are probably less important. Another challenge that I found as a manager of a health service is the range of doctors who are now using fluoroscopy in their daily work. Doctors using medical radiation are well beyond radiologists and radiation oncologists now, and getting appropriate training, credentialing and radiation safety awareness in the vascular surgeons, the orthopaedic surgeons and the cardiologists remains an important and challenging issue, and one that I know has concerned some of my state and territory colleagues who have the primary regulatory responsibility. So our message to the general public and to referring and procedural doctors needs to be one that while we have excellent and continuing advancing technology and great safety standards and high margins for error, we cannot be completely sure that repeated exposure to these diagnostic investigations with higher radiation doses will not ultimately be shown to have some long-term adverse effects. This needs to be taken into consideration, for example, when ordering an abdominal CT scan early in the assessment of simple abdominal pain in a young woman with intentions of future pregnancies. The Australian government is doing what it can in this space. Our Medicare Rebates, our universal health insurance scheme, for diagnostic tests have what we call a capital sensitivity rule, whereas if a diagnostic imaging piece of equipment is beyond what we see as a reasonable lifespan, you get reduced Medicare rebates, and that is a very strong incentive for people to replace old equipment. We're also about to embark on a significant education program with general practitioners on diagnostic imaging in low back pain. One of the major drivers of our My Health record, a universal electronic health record, has been to have a single point of reference for all pathology and imaging so that people who've had previous investigations, particularly CT scans, can have them accessible, or at least the reports accessible, and prevent unnecessary repeats. Let me move now to the field of radiation oncology. This is also developing at a rapid pace with a breathtaking change and in technology advancement. Unlike diagnostic radiology, where I am often in receipt of advocacy to reduce its unnecessary use, the converse is often true in radiation oncology, where there are clearly some areas of medicine where it is underutilised, despite now excellent evidence of therapeutic outcomes in cancer. And particularly in Australia, we've had a very strong program of investment in new linear accelerators across the country over the last 20 years. We now have a very good and well-distributed supply of radiation oncology centres, but there is clear evidence of underutilisation by some medical practitioners. The primary treatment of carcinoma of the prostate is probably the example that comes to mind most often, where we, I think, have a quite shamefully low incidence of primary radiation oncology as the initial treatment, partly because the patients are generally referred initially to the urologist, and many of whom do undertake proper broad consultation and get their patients to see a radiation oncologist, but not all do so. The radiation safety issues in radiation oncology are of course very different to that of diagnostic imaging, with very much larger doses required for the therapeutic intent. The issues in radiation protection for staff and the surrounding environment are much more complex, and the focus on the patient being treated is on targeting the affected area with as much precision as possible. It's interesting to conceptualise the issue of sparing of surrounding tissue as simply one of radiological protection. This issue has been brought home to me and is quite important to me in my current role as Chief Medical Officer, as I have the final appeal function for our medical treatment overseas program. This is a scheme where if evidence can be produced to show that a certain treatment is not available in Australia and that the Australian equivalents are significantly inferior, the Commonwealth Government will pay sometimes several $100,000 for people to travel overseas to have treatment. As you can imagine, one of the areas where often there are applications is for proton beam therapy in children. And the theoretical advantages of proton beam therapy clearly seem to be not so much around effective delivered dose to the target site, where it seems to be quite comparable to photon therapy, but rather it is the tight targeting and therefore the reduced dose to the surrounding tissues. The challenge is, of course, that there is an absence of long-term outcome data to show that that theoretical advantage of tighter targeting has clinical significance, and to the extent that proton treatment in a particular given circumstance is clearly clinically superior to the conventional photon therapy, which itself is now increasingly highly targeted with new technology. Of course, we will be getting our first proton unit, particle therapy unit in Australia in this city. It's going to be developed at the South Australia Institute for Health and Medical Research, and it will be an interesting challenge for us as a nation to define the health technology assessment approach, who will be paid to have access to this treatment, in fact who should have access to this treatment, and the criteria for access when you have treatment available locally versus overseas treatment. Again, those decisions will be guided by the best available evidence, and the best available evidence is often coming from people who are in this room. Because accurate targeted doses in radiation oncology is obviously the goal of all technical advances, including these new sophisticated measures. Whatever the technology in radiation oncology, this accurate measurement of dose and calibration of equipment is of paramount importance. In this regard, I should mention briefly the pride we have in our Panzer's role in leading edge work in the science of dosimetry. When I first went to our Panzer for a visit, I was stunned to find a fully functioning linear accelerator sitting there in the basement. Because over a decade ago, our Panzer embarked on a long-term strategic program to positively impact safe radiation therapy through improved dosimetry. You all know what dosimetry is. It's measuring ionising radiation in a given place or on a person. Our Panzer purchased one of the first two clinical linear accelerators ever installed at a primary standards laboratory in the world, the other being in the National Physics Laboratories in the UK. A Panzer's linear accelerator, which was recently replaced, has enabled it to embark on a long and complex transition from cobalt-based calibration of ionisation chambers to what is known as direct calibration. That is a primary standard calibration with a beam that is the same as those used in clinical practice. This removes the need for conversion factors and the potential for error. This has ensured that our dosimetry service through our Panzer is one of the most accurate in the world. The service has even included in recent years adaptation of the technique to simulate modern targeted beams through the use of specialised cones attached to the LINAC to more accurately detect radiation. This innovation has been widely welcomed internationally and has informed a national discussion around the safe and accurate use of small fields of treatment. This dosimetry service now covers 99% of Australian radiotherapy facilities as well as selected New Zealand facility and is embedded in a national practice. It provides great consistency across centres in clinical trials as well as in providing clinical standards and national and international harmonisation through the Global Harmonisation Group. The maintaining of primary standards, calibrating hospital chambers and the dosimetry service together form a coherent dosimetry loop for Australia. Not only does our Panzer calibrate the instruments which underpin therapy throughout the country, but this service ensures that calibrated chambers have been effectively used in the clinical space. I'd like to briefly focus on the issue of radioisotope supply for diagnostic purposes because this is becoming an international issue. As already mentioned, we're very proud of the world-class radiation protection standards we have in Australia. But one of the common challenges that we and other countries have is struggling to provide the best practice safe access to isotopes within the confines of complex and expensive to maintain and sometimes ageing infrastructure, while still ensuring we meet community needs. A couple of months ago, a mechanical fault at ANSTO, our Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation, resulted in a temporary halt to the production of molybdenum, which, as you all know, is the main parent isotope for most of the isotopes used in diagnostic imaging scans, bone scans and many others. For obvious radiation protection reasons, the faulty valve in the production line could not safely be replaced for several weeks. The impact of this valve meant that Australia was down to just a few weeks' supply, and with 12,500 patients a week requiring scans, we needed to come up with some other arrangements. But in sourcing international supplies, PANTA and ANSTO discovered that really the west of the world was in a very similar position, that there's not much redundancy of supply. Many other countries are facing similar production challenges because we've all been relying on now quite old technology, and there needs to be a significant advance in this area to ensure that there is international redundancy of supply. So we had to do some very interesting things while we sourced supplies from other countries, including provide access to PET scanning for indications which were not normally covered by the reimbursement policy. In conclusion, can I say that radiation in healthcare has played and will continue to play a crucial role in research, diagnosis and treatment. The technical advances in the application of radiation in healthcare are truly stunning, hard to keep up with, and materially improving the lives of our citizens. Any community concerned about radiation safeties in countries like Australia and many other countries in the world can be readily allayed by the evidence of the strong systems of radiation safety that we have. Systems that continue to evolve, as does the technology they are supporting. I hope to hear more about some of these advances over the course of this morning. Thank you so much for asking me to start the proceedings on today's very exciting program. I'm proud to be here and again to acknowledge the great work that you all do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Murphy. We have got some time for questions. In fact, just one has come through on our tablet. It says, do you have a primary standard for diagnostic X-ray?
I'll have to, as I said to you before, technical questions I might have to refer to people in the audience. Here's the man. Yes, but we can talk about it afterwards. Yeah.
Okay, now it is difficult to see hands, but I think I can see hands here, so please use the microphone. It's not on. It's not working.
I'll speak loud in my theater voice. Thank you very much for your discussion. I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Canada.
We can't hear, we need to get a microphone.
Oh, there we go. Okay. Thank you very much for the discussion. I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Canada. I work in diagnostic imaging as well, and I give medical students lectures on history and physical, then diagnostic tests, and then I get laughed at because the current practice in Emerge is get the CT and I'll see the patient. And I'm looking for creative ways to stop that practice because it's not patients first. It gives the radiologist no idea of what quadrant or what you're thinking. And I don't know if you have any insights as to creative ways to change that practice, which seems to be so ingrained with ordering physicians to say, get the CT and I'll come see the patient.
Yeah. So, in fact, it was interesting because when I became a hospital CEO, I missed clinical work. So, amazing, isn't it? So I went and the only time I could do clinical work was on a Sunday, because the only time spare time I had. So I used to go and do shifts in the emergency department, and I used to see all the old people because that's all they trusted me with, being a nephrologist. But I could observe the culture there, and that's when I saw this a surgical registrar making these statements. So I actually got all the surgical registrars together and said, I'm instructing the ED staff that unless, and obviously there are emergency situations, but in someone with routine non-urgent abdominal pain, they are not to order the CT scan unless they've been seen. And we introduced a policy. Now, to what extent that was adhered to at 3 o'clock in the morning, I don't know. But I think sometimes if you do bring out the whole gamut of things that is wrong with that, it's not just the potential exposure to radiation, it's the potential harm from overdiagnosis. Doing a CT scan in an old person with abdominal pain and finding, a lump in a kidney or something, and all the things that happen beyond that, to try and get people to understand that not actually ordering a test and potentially missing something that might have been seen on a test is not bad medicine. Good medicine is proportionate. So we see in our primary care practice now, we have about 6,000 primary care doctors who have been overseas trained and haven't completed their full Australian GP fellowship yet. Their rate of ordering of medical imaging is substantially greater than the more experienced primary care doctors because they're anxious. And so we've got to try and A, get them better trained, and B, instill in people this idea that not making a diagnosis is not necessarily bad medicine.
Thank you. There is another question here on the app. You highlighted the growing demand from a diverse group of medical specialists to use medical radiation. What are your views on credentialing in this area?
Well, I think ultimately the organisation that's providing the radiation services has to be confident. And I asked this question a lot when I was a CEO. I said, how confident are we? Because we're ultimately responsible for the safety of our staff and the patients. So ultimately, it is our responsibility. But I worked in Victoria in very close partnership with the state regulators in that space, and I think everyone who is delivering radiation needs to be properly credentialed, and I believe that's the practice across this nation, but I'm not sure what it is internationally.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the floor? Yes, there's a hand up there. Please use the microphone.
Thank you very much for impressive and informative talk here. I'm interested in the case of installation linear accelerator and cyclotron in the hospital. So who will do the responsibility of radiation safety during the installation? And the next, if you, in the case for running the machine, in the future, do you need to get any license based on the federal regulation?
Yes. I'm sure that, again, our colleagues at ARPANSA can talk about that, but there is a very strict regulatory control around cyclotrons. And it's very challenging stuff, cyclotron science. And, and one of the most precious resources we had was radiopharmacists. They are a very rare and unusual beast, but we certainly had to get very clear regulatory approval for every step in the cyclotron installation. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Before I ask a question, are there any more questions from the floor? Yes?
Hopefully, yeah, no worries. So in respect to medical uses in ionizing radiation, so obviously there's a few different beasts to try and wrangle, one of them being like radiopharmaceuticals. So, like, various agencies have kind of punted the responsibility of regulating some of the intricate natures of radiopharmaceuticals. Is there any consensus to whether some of these difficulties will be resolved in the future?
Look, I'm probably not expert enough to talk on that. It's technically pretty specific, and I might get my Panzer colleagues who are going to be talking later to address that. I know that they're regulated, and we do have. I was pretty confident when I, ran a PET research centre that the regulation was good and the standards were good, and I kept getting audits and assessments that things were good. But in terms of the general policy thing, I would probably be talking without a competence base if I speculated further.
Thank you. I think I'm going to ask you the last question. Early in your talk, you mentioned about the general population and their unjustified and disproportionate fear of radiation. We in radiological protection have a continuing challenge to communicate with the public. So do you have any strategies that you can share with us to try and allay these fears of the general public?
Yeah, I think data is probably the best thing to do. I mean, we were talking last night about the number of deaths that came from the evacuation of Fukushima was significant, and the number of deaths were, if none or negligible. And so, just providing information about, what are the long-term effects is probably the best thing I can think of, because people, when educated people certainly respond to data and information. That's certainly what we've, when I was in the non-ionising space, when I was dealing with a senior government MP who'd been riled up by her constituents, I had some wonderful people from our Panzer with me who talked about the relative impact of standard AM radio compared to 5G, and showing that we've been exposed to energy, of that level for a long time without any impact. And just providing the facts is probably the best thing to do.
Thank you very much. Well, once again, I'd like to thank Professor Murphy very much indeed for giving up his time to come to our conference. Thank you.